Applause, please, for our final speaker for the Cabaret Dance Ideas 2019, Mhairi Aitken!
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, I'm Mhairi Aitken. I'm a Senior Research Associate at Newcastle University. And as you can probably guess by the title of this show, my work is all about algorithms. And in particular, it's about the role that algorithms are playing in our lives and the effects that algorithms are having on our society. Because algorithms really are transforming our society. And they also have a big impact on some very personal areas of our lives. So for example, if you're on a dating website are increasingly using algorithms to match people up, to find the perfect match, to calculate the compatibility of different users of the sites. So if you're on a dating website, and that dating website finds you, your perfect match, finds you somebody that you have 100% compatibility with, that'd be pretty exciting, right? I mean, that's going to be real butterflies in the tummy when you go on that date. It's going to be pretty exciting. But imagine you go on that date, you meet your perfect match, the person that the website says you're 100% compatible with. But that person turns out to be a bit of a sex pest. Some people might be happy with that, I'm not here to judge, but others perhaps not. And in that instance, you might want to kind of scrutinise what it is about your own profile that made you seem such a good match. Or you could just blame it on the algorithm. But of course the question then is, did the algorithm get it wrong? Or does the algorithm in fact know you better than you know yourself? And I think that's a big question that applies to lots of areas in which algorithms are making decisions about us as individuals, as well as decisions about this kind of society that we want to live in. And algorithms have been used in all kinds of things. So things like in banking, if you applied for a mortgage or a loan, if that application was rejected, you can also blame that on the algorithm. Because increasingly algorithms are playing a big part in decisions about who gets access to finance, which applications for loans and mortgages are approved or rejected, and so really significant implications for people's lives. So in tonight's show is blame it on the algorithm. So I'm going to be discussing, or giving you lots of ideas and examples of things that you might blame on algorithms. And I'll be interested to hear your own examples of ideas that you might have of things that you might want to blame on algorithms. But of course, as Susan said, this show is part of the Cabaret of Dangerous Ideas. So I, of course, have some dangerous ideas for you. In particular, I have two dangerous ideas that I want to propose to you tonight, that I want to convince you of over the course of this evening. The first dangerous idea is that evil is okay. A little bit of evil, not such a bad thing. I know that's a controversial one, but over the course of this evening, I'm hoping to bring you round to my way of thinking. The second dangerous idea is that the nemesis, the downfall of a well-thought-through, well-developed algorithm is in fact a kangaroo. And I'm going to propose to you this evening that we all need to be looking out for kangaroos, because kangaroos are all around us all the time. And will be revealed a little bit later. But yeah, so we're going to be talking about algorithms. And I wanted to give you some examples of the kinds of things that the kinds of ways that algorithms are making decisions, are impacting your lives, are impacting our society. But there's far too many examples. I found it really hard to choose. So I thought, you can choose. I don't know where to start, I really don't. So I have some plenty of examples, and I want you to choose which ones we discuss first. So we're going to play a game. We're going to play Blame It on the Algorithm. Susan, would you like to be my glamorous assistant?
Oh, God. I've waited all my life for this. This is so exciting.
So these...
Am I glamorous? Oh, right.
These are my cards of algorithmic decision making. Right. No peeking on the other side. Each of these cards has an image. It's an image of something that you can blame on an algorithm. So Susan, I want you to take the cards to the audience, pick a random audience member to, with no algorithmic decision making, entirely randomly, choose a card. Look at the image and tell us what you think that image represents.
Harry Potter?
Harry Potter! Did you know that you can blame Harry Potter on an algorithm?
Oh, that was supposed to be J.K. Rowling. There we go. Right, I'll take that. Does that take like that again?
So not all of Harry Potter, but how many Harry Potter books are there? The 8th Harry Potter book you can blame on an algorithm. It's not written by J.K. Rowling, it is written by a bot. It's written by an algorithm, a computer program, which can automatically generate text in the style of pretty much anything you like. So there's a website called Botnik. You can go into Botnik and you can enter all kinds of text, or you can generate all kinds of text in all kinds of styles. So it could be in the style of, say, Michael Jackson, it could be in the style of the Bee Gees, anybody you like. People have done it with Donald Trump, so they've tortured this algorithm with Donald Trump speeches, inputting lots of Donald Trump speeches, and then it can automatically generate a convincing Donald Trump speech. And it's amazing because it pretty much makes no sense, but it really sounds like Donald Trump. And people have done this with Harry Potter, so they've entered in chapters from Harry Potter books, and it creates a kind of predictive text keyboard, which can then generate a new chapter in the style of Harry Potter. And luckily for you, I have a very rare first edition copy of Harry Potter and the portrait of what looked like a large pile of ash.
That is one shit title.
And as a real treat, I'm going to read you an excerpt.
Oh, bedtime story.
Let's do it again. So, I'm just getting into character. The castle grounds snarled with a wave of magically magnified wind. The sky outside was a great black ceiling which was full of blood. The only sounds drifting down from Hagrid's hut were the disdainful shrieks of his own furniture. Magic. It was something that Harry Potter thought was very good. Leathery sheets of rain lashed at Harry's ghost as he walked across the grounds toward the castle. Ron was standing there, doing a kind of frenzied tap dance. He saw Harry and immediately began to eat Hermione's family. It gets better. What about Ron magic, offered Ron. To Harry, Ron was a loud, slow and soft bird. Harry did not like to think about birds. Death Eaters are on top of the castle, Ron bleated, quivering. Ron was going to be spiders. He just was. He wasn't proud of that, but it was going to be hard to not have spiders all over his body after all is said and done. Let's skip forward to the dramatic climax.
The climax.
Okay, so Ron's the handsome one, muttered Harry as he reluctantly reached for his wand. The casters fell to, and jets of green light shot out of Death Eaters' heads. Ron flinched. Not so handsome now, thought Harry, as he dipped Hermione in hot sauce. The Death Eaters were dead now, and Harry was hungrier than he had ever been.
Can't wait to see that film.
I'm not a big Harry Potter fan, but I do think that might be the best book. It's the classic book. But there's a great example to start on. I really like that example because it's an example. It's kind of fun, right? It's kind of silly. It doesn't really matter too much. But it's an example of where kind of anybody can use this thing. So this is a website anybody can go on. You can do whatever you like. So you can put in whatever text you want. You could automatically generate your letters for your Christmas cards next year. Susan, you could automatically generate a script for your next comedy routine, should you wish. Anything you like.
Thank you. Fine.
And it's kind of fun. And maybe it doesn't matter too much, because it's just kind of silly. You know, it works for comedy, it works for kind of parody, and it's light-hearted. But there are concerns that these kinds of algorithms could be used for things that do really matter. So they could be used to generate convincing legal documents, to generate documents in the style of legal language, which are entirely fake but entirely convincing. They could be used very topically to generate kind of fake news, so to generate news content which seems entirely credible or entirely realistic, but is actually entirely automated. There's also questions about what this means for creativity and kind of intellectual endeavours. You know, we tend to think, or we hear a lot about the risks to unemployment through increased automation, increased artificial intelligence. We tend to think about that in terms of kind of mechanical jobs or kind of manual jobs, which can be more easily automated. We tend to think that, say, creative industries or more intellectual pursuits are kind of safe from automation. But actually, this raises some quite big questions about what's possible in the future. Will creative industries also be affected by automation? And that's a question we can come back to later. I think we should move on to the next card.
I think over here.
Laughing pig.
It's a laughing pig.
Very good. It is in fact a happy pig, but I will accept laughing pig.
The audience to maybe this pig is laughing. That is one laughing pig.
Well, I would say it's a very happy pig. But this relates to a research project which was conducted in Edinburgh at Scotland's Rural College, where they've been developing a kind of facial recognition program which can detect the emotional states of pigs. So it can detect when a pig is a happy pig or a not so happy pig. And the idea behind this is that it can be used in pig farms to detect when a pig is perhaps becoming unwell, when it has a kind of a condition before it gets too bad. And I should clarify, this isn't kind of, like kids' storybook farmyards in the backyard, lovely pig farms. This is kind of industrial scale pig farms, where you've got hundreds of pigs in small confines, and the farmers or the workers there aren't really able to kind of keep, on a daily basis, keep an eye on monitoring the well-being of their pigs. So in many cases, pigs become ill, nobody notices until it becomes a very serious condition which requires expensive medical treatment, or perhaps it's the end of the pig. So this program, it's a machine learning program, so the scientists, the researchers have developed this by teaching the algorithm how to recognize a happy pig or a less happy pig. So they do this, how machine learning works is they'll show it images of happy pigs with a label, it may be more complex than this in reality, but a label that is happy pig, and then show some images of some less happy pigs, which is not happy pig. They show the computer program, the algorithm, enough of these examples that the algorithm is then able to learn how to recognize a happy pig and a not happy pig. So this can then create a facial recognition program which can be installed in pig farms to monitor the well-being of a pig and detect when it is becoming less than a happy pig. And when I heard that example, I thought it was a great example because it's a really positive one. Facial recognition has been in the news a lot lately, and it's pretty controversial. So it's been used a lot by police to monitor crowds, to detect suspicious individuals, to identify people for stop and search purposes. It's been used by advertisers to monitor reactions to billboards. So in Piccadilly Circus, there are big billboards and there are cameras with facial recognition which are monitoring the crowds, identifying people, making some assumptions about gender, age, and monitoring their emotional response so they can monitor the effectiveness of algorithms. So there's lots of examples of facial recognition which kind of are a little bit uncomfortable, raise kind of questions about whether or not we're consenting to this, how comfortable do you feel about people monitoring your faces in public spaces. So I like this example because I kind of think the pigs probably don't mind that much. Like, they're probably not too bothered about informed consent. They kind of have more kind of life and death issues to be worried about. But at the same time, I kind of think that maybe it's an example of where investment in technology is focusing at really addressing the symptoms of a problem rather than the problem itself. And actually, the more I think about it, I start to feel a bit sad about those pigs and why aren't they happy in the first place? But that's maybe a different story. Can we have another card?
This young man, sort of perhaps you could choose a card. Take the card. Take the blue one. Take the blue one.
Handcuffs?
Handcuffs, yes.
Right.
Exactly.
Just keep your filthy thoughts to
Well, exactly. This almost got me in a lot of trouble. I was on a train back from London when I was looking for images to use on these cards, and I did do a Google image search quite innocently for handcuffs, and before you know it, my screen was full of pictures of handcuffs in use, but not by law enforcement. And I don't know what it was about Google's algorithm that made them think that that's what I was interested in, but it did make for a very uncomfortable 4 hours on the train. But yes, this is about policing, this is about law enforcement. Because algorithms are increasingly being used to make decisions about where arrests are made, where crime is detected, and also what happens to individuals after they're convicted of a crime. So for example, there's something called Predpol. Predpol, predictive policing, is an algorithm which was developed in the US, but is now it's a commercial product and it's bought by police forces around the world, including by Kent, the Kent Police Force. And they used Predpol for a number of years to predict where crime was likely to happen. It didn't predict who was likely to conduct a crime, but in what areas crime was likely to happen. And this is based on historic data about where crime was detected or where arrests were made. And this was considered to be really effective. It was considered to increase efficiency within policing because they could direct resources exactly where crime was most likely to occur. But of course there's big problems because if you're deciding where crime is likely to happen based on data about where you found crime in the past, there's a risk that you kind of get into a bit of a cycle there where crime has been detected more in the past or where police have focused their efforts more, well then you're going to have more data about crime there which suggests that you've got to focus your efforts there more in the future. So it kind of becomes a bit of a loop. There's also some concerns that these kind of predictive policing approaches tend to be focused on certain types of crime. So it tends to be street crime, and there's some evidence that these predictive policing approaches, certainly in the US, have tended to lead to more arrests of, say, disadvantaged groups and typically ethnic minority groups. So there's big questions, not necessarily about the accuracy of the algorithm, but how it's being used and the decisions that we're making about in what instances or for what kinds of purposes we're using those algorithms. Just to make that point a bit more clearly, a few years ago there was an artist who collaborated with some data scientists in the US to develop a similar predictive policing algorithm, but focusing on white-collar crime. And they did this in order to illustrate the injustices and how this was being used, and to kind of make the point about what we think is fair in these approaches. But what was really interesting, so they used the same approaches, they used very rigorous data science approaches, they used similar kinds of data about where white-collar crime are being been committed, whether there have been convictions, who had been convicted, and they created a map which are kind of hotspots of where you're most likely to find white-collar crime. And you could even download an app on your phone which would alert you when you were walking into an area where you might, whoa, white-collar crime. And as you can imagine, these were quite affluent areas. There were a lot of hotspots in Manhattan. They went one step further though, and they looked at images of convicted white-collar criminals to generate a kind of generic image of what a white-collar criminal might look like. Which sounds crazy, but actually there's been very similar things proposed for street crime and other kinds of crime, and you can imagine that there are certain biases and prejudices around what that looks like or what it means in practice. Anyway, in this instance, it created an image of a fairly generic middle-aged white man. And a lot of middle-aged white men were really upset about this. Really upset. This is outrageous. How can you do this? How can you make assumptions about what somebody of this profile might do in the future based on just what other people who had similar profiles did in the past? Which is kind of the whole point. Because that's what people have been doing. It hasn't been middle-aged white men they've been doing it to. So I think it makes a really strong example of where it's not necessarily the algorithm itself, but what we're using it for, and the questions around where we're spending those resources and what kind of purposes we're using that for. Next card, please.
There's a lovely young lady down the front who's really intelligent. There we'll go for what we got there. Ooh, is that a Pokemon thing? Little devil?
It is evil.
It's evil! To be fair, it's kind of cute cuddly. I wouldn't like to wake up and find that at the end of it, but that has happened to me on occasion.
So I promised you that I was going to convince you that evil was okay. And this is the moment. Evil is okay. If you have noticed an increase in evil over the last 18 months or so, you can blame it on an algorithm. Specifically on algorithms by Google algorithms. And to give a bit of context to explain that statement, I'll need to take a few steps back. So Google, for a long time, Google has had a kind of code of conduct. It's a code of conduct that guides Google employees, it kind of sets the ethos of the company. And in that code of conduct, for years and years, they've had this sort of mantra that Google employees go by, which is, don't be evil, which is beautiful. I mean, essentially, it takes kind of all the core messages of the world's religions and distills it down into one easily digestible core message, which is beautiful. But so early in 2018, there was a bit of controversy around Google, as there often is. But in this instance, it centered on Google's involvement in something called Project Maven. Now, Project Maven was a project where Google were collaborating with the Pentagon in the US, and they were looking at images from drones. So these are drones that the Pentagon and the US military were using to drop bombs in distant locations. Now, these drones are monitored by human operatives, by military operatives, who look at the images from the drones and decide whether or not to drop the bomb, to press the button, or whether or not to drop a bomb. Which is, fundamentally, it's a life and death decision, right? So anyway, Google were involved in this project, and they were looking at images from the drones, and they were looking at past human judgments about whether or not to drop bombs, to train an algorithm which could potentially, just potentially, but potentially in the not too distant future, automate decisions about whether or not to drop bombs. And this was a pretty tricky one. A lot of people got very upset. A lot of Google employees left the company, threatened to leave the company over this. And people started to point out that there was maybe a bit of a discrepancy between not being evil and killing people, or training computers to kill people. And it was a fair point. And so Google clearly agonized over this for weeks, I think. And eventually they put their hands up and they said, we're going to do the right thing. And they dropped "Don't be evil" from the code of conduct. True story. And I just think that's amazing. I mean, for all the employees at Google, that must have just been so liberating. But it's crazy, and it kind of, you think, what does that mean? What's really, why would you need to do that? But also, what's really interesting about it is they dropped "Don't be evil," but they kept "Do the right thing." Which it kind of implies that sometimes they do the right thing. A little bit of evil, never did any harm, did it? So yeah. Evil is okay. Next card.
Right, next card is a lovely lady in front of you, amazingly thoughtful and intelligent. Two yellow ones there. Singing a song. Oh, it's two lovely people singing a song in a very sort of romantic setting. He's strumming on a guitar, trying to impress her. It's got to be said, she doesn't look that impressed. I'm not sure if it's going well. She's got a basket of nice fruit and vegetables there, but at least that's one sorted.
This is, and I'll probably pronounce this wrong, but this is El Serenata del Amor, Portuguese, the Serenade of Love. And it centres around a main character called Rosie. But from that point on, it's a lot less romantic. This is actually Rosie is an algorithm, and Rosie detects government fraud, government misuse of expenses. So Rosie is an algorithm which monitors or processes kind of public data about elected officials' expenses MPs' expenses, and can process all that data to detect suspicious activity or potential fraudulent expense claims. Which is brilliant, isn't it? And I love it because it's an example where this is really citizen-led. It's members of the public deciding they're going to use this public accessible data to hold elected officials to account. And it shows that really all this data can be used by anybody. It doesn't need to be big companies or corporations. It doesn't need to be government. It can be anybody who can put a purpose to that data. So I think it's a beautiful example. And we have one last card.
I'm going to do it because I think this might be a piece de resistance. And it is, ladies and gentlemen, a rather aggressive-looking kangaroo. I don't think there is actually any other kind of kangaroo. They all seem pretty angry to me. But that's what it is. It's a kangaroo.
This is the kangaroo, I promised. And it's one of very many kangaroos. But this relates to a story about autonomous vehicles, so driverless cars. And it relates to Volvo. So Volvo were developing an autonomous vehicle, a driverless car, in Sweden. And the tests were going very well, it was developing very well, it was performing very well, it was out on the roads, functioning perfectly. And it was being trained to do all kinds of things. It was trained to recognise when a pedestrian steps out into the road to know to stop. It was also trained to recognise when an animal steps out into the road and to know to stop. But it was trained on Swedish animals. So it was very good if a moose walked out into the road, if an elk walked out into the road. They took the same car to Australia to run some further tests in different conditions. It had no clue what to do. It failed spectacularly because it's very good at recognising Swedish animals. It has no idea what a kangaroo is. Because kangaroos are weird, right? So they jump up in the air and they look very far away. They land and suddenly they look really close. And this car was just, it couldn't compute this. So I think what this example shows us is that how an algorithm is developed, or the context in which it develops, is really important for how it operates. So there's kinds of assumptions around what an algorithm needs to know, or whose interests it needs to protect. I imagine if the same car had been developed in Australia, it probably would have recognised kangaroos very well. It probably would have thought about teaching it about kangaroos much earlier, and it might not have recognised moose. And that's an analogy that can apply to all kinds of things, probably to all the examples we've discussed tonight. We need to watch out for kangaroos, because there are kangaroos in all of these instances. So for example, facial recognition. Facial recognition is incredibly accurate if you're white, much less accurate if you have a darker skin tone. And that's really important when we're using facial recognition to monitor crowds for surveillance to detect suspicious faces. It's going to work okay for you if you happen to be white. And perhaps that's because it's mostly been developed by white men. and it's a really important fact because these algorithms have been developed from very privileged positions, and they represent the interests of the groups that are developing them. So actually we need to think about kangaroos in all the instances when these algorithms have been developed, where they're being used in important ways that impact on our lives, that impact on our society, whose interests are shaping those algorithms, and whose interests are excluded or are not thought about in those processes. And actually, it's not just about thinking about the interests of the kangaroos, but we need the kangaroos to be developing the algorithms. Because the reason that their interests aren't being taken on board is because they're not actually there. They're not in the process of developing these algorithms or deciding how they're going to be used. So that's why, as a takeaway message from tonight, I want it to be, watch out for kangaroos, but also, let's get kangaroos designing algorithms. And at that point, I think it's time to ask you, what do you think? Are these things that we can blame on the algorithm, or what kinds of questions should we be asking about the role that algorithms are playing in our lives and the impact that algorithms are having on our society? And I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on that, also to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a microphone here. If anyone wants to stick your hand in there, I'll come running up. It's just so that everyone can hear what you've got to say. My question would be, the facial recognition might be okay, even if you are a white-skinned person, but if you've got enough slap on your face, you're unrecognisable even to your own mother. Never mind a computer. So can they work their way around that? Can they see what you've got? Way too much foundational, madam.
There might be some assumptions about what kind of profile you match, what kind of person you are, based on all kinds of things about your appearance. That's kind of how it works. They're making assumptions about what you might do or what kind of person you might be based on similar people who have kind of similar characteristics to you, whatever that might be. It could be anything, we don't really know. And that's the thing about machine learning programs, that actually machine learning algorithms, they're designed by data scientists, by computer programmers, but they're kind of the way it works is it's like teaching a child. You know, you teach them something, you give them the ground rules, and then you kind of set them off into the world and hope they make good decisions. With a machine learning algorithm, you're giving it the basics, you're training it, like an example of pig, happy pig. But then you're asking it to then go off into the future and decide who's a happy pig. But you don't really know how it's doing that. You don't really know quite what it actually is basing those decisions on. You kind of put it off into the world and hope that you've given it trained it well enough. And so in those kinds of things, it's making those assumptions, it's looking at images of people and it's classifying people and grouping people. We don't always know exactly what it is that is basing those decisions on, or why certain people are being flagged in certain ways or being attached to certain profiles or given certain labels.
Oh, question.
Yes, just following on from that, if we think of the example of the child, then typically the child stays a child for long enough that the parent can say, no, you're doing that wrong, do it correctly.
Yeah.
So is that similar with machine learning? Can you keep track of the kinds of pigs that it thinks are happy and
and that's really important. So when a machine learning program does, leave home and go off and start functioning, what is really important is there is some kind of feedback mechanism so that you can control it and give feedback. So if it produces a result that is wrong, that isn't accurate, there's some way of telling the algorithm that it got it wrong and correcting it, and at the same time letting it know that it's functioning properly. It's really important that there are ways of checking how these things are going and checking their accuracy. And also in the case of the examples of if we had an algorithm that's deciding whether or not to drop bombs, well, our criteria might change in the future. Like a decision might match what a human operative decided in the year that they developed that algorithm. But in 10 years' time, it might be completely different, or in a different context, it's going to be completely different. So that's, it's absolutely crucial that with these algorithms, they're not something that you develop and then you use and it can stay the same, but actually we need to think about how they reflect the values of our society. Do they actually match what we want them to do? And probably that needs to be updated as they're being used and checked.
Oh, right to the right. I'm a bit worried about these computers learning how to bomb things, because that's how the film Terminator started.
Sorry for my English, but do you think we can blame like the Trump election or the Brexit on algorithms? Because it's really hard discussed, because of Cambridge Analytica and things like that. But is it okay to blame it on the algorithm, or is it a society topic?
Yeah, and in that instance, blaming it on the algorithm is perhaps a kind of, a way of avoiding thinking about the deeper issues underlying that. So why can money buy you that influence? Why can it? And that's not about the algorithm or the technology. That's something much more systemic, and it's about the power that certain actors are able to have. And also the question, in terms of in the case of Facebook, there's been a lot of resistance to have any form of regulation of what happens on Facebook as a platform. But actually, there's much bigger questions there where it's not. The algorithm was used as a way to have those effects, but it's not the algorithm that did it. And those decisions about, well, who gets access to that data and who gets to use that data, and who decides what purposes are okay or not okay. And then the other thing about whether we blame it on an algorithm, in the case of Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, is that actually, what was really interesting in that case, when that happened, suddenly there was this huge controversy, and people were suddenly talking about data and talking about Facebook data, and initially there was a kind of like, okay, everybody leave Facebook, but it didn't really stick, did it? And I think there's a real danger there that when things like that happen, we kind of go like, oh, that's terrible. And then we kind of go, oh well, like we never really trusted Facebook anyway, so let's just carry on. And that's really dangerous because it's that kind of complacency. Like we need to make decisions about how we're sharing our data and how we're using our data, and not be complacent or not expect that sometimes it will be bad. It shouldn't happen like that. So it should be, we need to be different, I think.
Oh, question from here.
From a scientific perspective, the algorithm for detecting, for example, white-collar crime seems to me to have a major flaw, and that's detected white-collar crime.
Yeah.
The successful guys.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm saying guys.
Yeah, no, exactly. And again, because that is how all these predictive policing, and the predictive policing is very much being used. It's being used in all kinds of ways. A lot in the US, but here in the UK as well, it's been used a lot. There's lots of experiments, lots of trials of predictive policing. And that's the big problem, that all of this relies on data, but it's the data that we have. And all of this, in policing, in banking, finance, everything that it is the data is based on historic data. So it's based on where we have detected crime before, well then that's where we have the data, so that's where we're going to look again in the future, which leads to areas that are already being over-policed, probably being more over-policed. And so actually there needs to be a way to think about, well, it could be considered accurate if it's accurate based on the data going in, but is that data really an accurate portrayal of society, of the wider issue? And that's a much harder thing, because then you need to think about, well, where are we collecting this data from? Where is it coming from? And what kinds of assurances do we need that it doesn't have prejudices or biases built into it? And that's a big problem in all areas of algorithms.
So if we can't get kangaroos into meetings about algorithms, who should we be having in there?
Well,
Kangaroos are very difficult to get into offices.
they are. But it's diversity. So the big problem is that computer programmers, data scientists is predominantly male, and in the big companies such as Google, it's predominantly white. And so we need greater diversity. We need different perspectives from all kinds of things. So it's not just it's gender, it's ethnicity, it's age, it's backgrounds, cultural perspective, social perspective, everything. And these are all these different perspectives, because these algorithms are affecting all areas of our life. They're affecting decisions about all aspects of society, and the implications that they have, or the potential negative impacts, it cuts across all aspects of society. So we need to make sure that there are these different perspectives in the room. Because even with the best of intentions, data scientists or policymakers who are making decisions based on algorithms, they might have the best of intentions, but if there aren't people in the room able to say, that doesn't quite work, where I come from, there's going to be this problem, or if you apply that in this context, something's going to come up. You need people there who can speak from those different perspectives and those experiences. And if they're kangaroos, you need the kangaroos. But the kangaroo, it could be all kinds of things. But we need people who can speak from different perspectives to know what's going to be likely to potentially to occur before it's actually happening. And then people say, well, if you'd asked us, we could have told you that.
So you focus quite a lot on the potential negatives of using it, particularly in human context and social context. What are your views on sort of potentially more positive use of algorithms? So I'm thinking of things like conservation, where it's been used quite effectively to identify areas of habitat where we can restore species and we can fight against endangered species and that kind of thing.
There's some really, really positive examples around that. Again, it relates to the data that's collected. But what's really, in conservation examples, is really interesting cases where this is data that can be collected by anybody. So that there are algorithms where anybody can input this, anybody can use it or can add to it by data that they observe in all kinds of different ways. I also think that there are real positives, that a lot of the concerns that we have, a lot of the negative examples, is where these algorithms are being developed and used by big companies. So if our data is being used by the likes of Amazon, Google, it's been used to I guess, increase the profits of those companies. It has real economic value. But our data also has other kinds of value. So the value doesn't have to just be economic. And actually what I think is really exciting, where there's a huge amount of potential, is using that data to bring value for society. So actually having people, members of the public, anybody, thinking about, well, if I had access to this kind of data, I could answer these questions, I could solve these problems. So community groups, volunteer groups, civil society, charities, thinking about, what are the problems that they have, what are the big questions, and how could data answer those questions? Because there's a huge amount of data that is open, that is public. The example from Brazil of Serenata de l'Amor, that was public data, that was citizens who decided we can use this data to hold government to account. But there's plenty of other examples. Edinburgh City Council have a lot of open data, public data about City Council stuff, transport, all kinds of stuff, right? All kinds of statistics, figures, data. Academic researchers such as myself, we're increasingly being expected to deposit all our data in repositories to make it publicly accessible. And that's data from all kinds of disciplines, all kinds of things that it might tell you. The idea is that then that data is, other researchers could, test the findings of our study, could reconduct the study, but that data is also available to anybody to use for whatever purpose. And I think very few people know about that, maybe very few people care about that, maybe it's only other academics that want to go and look at academic data, but it's there, and it's really valuable and it's really useful. So actually what I think would be really exciting is that members of the public, citizens, public groups, community groups, whoever it is, think about that, look at that data and think about how can we use that and how can we use it to address the needs of our communities, of our societies, and there's huge potential there.
Oh, so this is what I like audiences to make sure that they ask questions at the very other end of the room so that I get exercise. I've got
if we take GDPR as a starting point for explainability and data ownership, well, what regulations would you like to see in place specifically?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think GDPR is a really good start. I think what GDPR is that it's really powerful. It really empowers, or it can really empower people. But people have to use it. People have to, demand to know what the data is, demand how the data is being used. People have to complain and actually make it work. If people do that, then it can have a huge impact, and it can be really, really positive. But people have to, really do it and use it. And I think that's for me, that's the thing. It's about getting people to care about what's happening with their data, and to care enough to actually take action and ask questions and do things with it. So in terms of regulation, well, I think maybe GDPR is a really good start, but it's about actually empowering people, encouraging people to. I've lost my train of thought completely. I definitely had a better answer, but but I think that for me, that's the thing. It's about how you get people to use the regulation that's there and to actually to take action and do stuff with it.
In banking, before you use an algorithm, you'd still be looking at the person who wants to borrow the money, and you'd use some intuition. Is there any way that algorithms can introduce intuition or elements of risk, which can therefore allow great things to happen?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. So algorithms could definitely. Intuition might be a human quality, but then I don't know, because creativity, intellectual, those kinds of things, think of human qualities, but increasingly think, well, actually, algorithms kind of can have that. In terms of, I don't know if this relates to intuition, but in terms of creativity, there's an example I read recently of, it was an algorithm which was being used in a kind of virtual simulation, being used to land crash or emergency land planes. And the task the algorithm was set was land these planes with minimal force, but keeping the plane intact. But the algorithm somehow figured out that if it completely smashed the plane into the ground, like overpowered it in maximum force, the computer program had no idea how to compute that, so it registered it as a perfect score. So this algorithm just kept doing it, just smash the planes again and again, smash them, and it looked like it was doing brilliantly until somebody checked and went, whoa, no, that's not what we meant. And so that's an example of, I don't know if it comes close to intuition, but it's an example where we think that we can program an algorithm to perform a certain function. But actually, in the case of machine learning, where this algorithm then works that out itself, what's the most efficient way to do that, we don't really know what the reasoning is. And maybe that's a lack of human intuition then to actually think, or a lack of morality, I guess, to think, well, that might have served the purpose in terms of getting the perfect score, but it definitely didn't do what we wanted it to do. And so yes, maybe that's where you do need some kind of human judgment.
Your intuition can go horribly wrong. I've seen a lot of marriages based on intuition.
How would you know if I hacked your algorithm to distort your outputs?
Yeah, well, that's another. Okay, so that's another one which relates to needing to kind of monitor and to check the function of an algorithm. There should be kind of checks and balances in place to minimise the possibility of that happening, but it could happen. Yeah, it could happen, and so there needs to be kind of human oversight of human monitoring of the algorithms, and I guess that's something that is maybe not acknowledged enough. That we have a sense that in an algorithm, once it's functioning, it's up and running, everything's automated. But actually, if you leave it fully automated, then you don't really know when something's going wrong, or if somebody hacks it, or the malicious use or malicious intrusion into the function of the algorithm. So yeah, you need some kind of oversight, and there could be algorithms that oversee algorithms to monitor what's happening with those algorithms, and even an algorithm to oversee that algorithm. But maybe at some point we do need humans to be involved in those processes and to be questioning and monitoring and checking that is that how it was meant to be.
The scale of these importance of these algorithms encourages in several areas, like fighting wars, making decisions about who gets bombed, possibly they're very heavily involved in healthcare, and automating some of the complicated processes of surgery and things like that. Those are areas at the moment that are heavily regulated by law. So when there's people involved, the legal process can step in and put limits on what people do. If you've got a learning algorithm, I don't see how it can learn the law, or that limit can be provided. How would algorithms get into areas where the law should really be regulating it? How would they work?
And actually, I think the problem is, maybe this is the other way around, but the problem at the moment is that the technologies are developing faster than the law, or faster than regulation is adapting. The problem we have now is that so things like Cambridge Analytica, all these kind of controversies that come out, and we don't have the regulation to fully address it, because actually what we're discovering is that the technology has developed so much faster, and the law is kind of catch up. Because actually what you need is the regulation to anticipate what could happen, to anticipate the potential harms, and to anticipate what might need regulated in the future. But the pace of those two disciplines is vastly different, so that actually the law isn't keeping a pace with the development of technology. So then that has implications for then if you're using technology in an area that should be regulated. So yes, there's a lot of machine learning, artificial intelligence in healthcare, in health research, and also increasingly developing diagnostic tools in healthcare. And some of these work incredibly well, incredibly effective. But it does raise questions then about, so say we have an algorithm developed by a private sector organisation, which has happened, or happened through collaboration with the NHS, using NHS data. And then we have questions about, well, so how is that regulated, and who then owns that algorithm, and who makes decisions about how it's being used, and actually do we know or do we trust how that data might actually be used in that sort of collaboration? And I think that's something where we need to be really careful, because there's huge benefits from using algorithms in, say, healthcare and health research, huge benefits. But we need the law and regulation to be ahead of the curve, to know what it needs to be, what it needs to anticipate, what might be the potential harms that could come out of those new approaches.
Right, an algorithm to support the algorithm. Would you make that? Because the cable's got caught.
I studied informatics, and a professor of mine always said software is eating the world. So does the internet, and what do you think would happen if the world would be one day without internet? What would you do, and what would happen?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one. It's a really interesting, because so many things are automated now, and we rely on the internet for so many things. I mean, for connectivity, for social, for connecting with our friends, for connecting with our family, for accessing services, for getting information about all kinds of things. We rely on the internet so much. But we also rely on automation in so many ways. So monitoring, when we're collecting data about our health, we're monitoring our health, we're monitoring our activities, we have Fitbits, we're getting directions, we increasingly rely on sat-nav, all these kinds of things where things are automated, and we're relying on algorithms to help us in some of the most basic functions of our life. If all of that suddenly went away, hopefully we would still know what to do. But there is a very real question of, would we? And I think it's a bit like cars. So in the past, cars, you open the bonnet, and I wouldn't know, but apparently you could know what was there, and you would know how to fix it if something went wrong. Cars have increasingly become kind of computers, and now you open the bonnet and it's a plastic box and you don't know what's inside, and so you call the garage. And I think that's kind of an analogy of what happens in many of these areas of our life. So the things that people used to know very well, maybe reading a map, that now we rely on sat-nav, or we rely on an algorithm, an automated process to help us get from A to B. So does that mean if that process, that algorithm isn't there anymore, can we find a way? Can we still read a map? I hope so. But I guess of each generation, these kinds of skills, there is a danger that some basic skills get lost as more and more processes get automated.
Can an algorithm spot lies? Well, apparently you said with the right, so take it back to the dating thing, right?
Yeah.
I'm too old to be using Twitter. Sorry. I'm not sure what this is. Two guys turn up into the snow off your drive. I don't know anyway, but I do know for a fact that people just put fibs in, and I know that the profile photographs from some of my friends' misadventures were probably taken like back in the days when the guy had to put a curtain over his head. So can an algorithm, something of that sort of thing, you were talking about your romantic life being taken over by an algorithm, but in that particular instance, I know it will shock you, Mhairi, but people fib. Now, can an algorithm spot that?
Maybe it could, but actually, maybe your lies are compatible with another person's lies. It's compatibility of profiles. So whether or not there might be a kind of what you share makes you compatible. Maybe it's not necessarily who you are, but it's how you depict yourself and your representation of yourself. Maybe, I don't know, maybe that allows for compatibility. Whether algorithms can detect lies, that is a contentious area. There are algorithms, facial recognition programs, which are being developed to test honesty, to detect when somebody might be telling a lie. And they're being used in border control for refugees or asylum seekers, to monitor their faces, to assess whether they're lying about where they come from, why they come, how old they are, those kinds of details, which is quite shocking, because you ask really big questions about, well, how have they decided what is an honest face and a dishonest face, and how is that applied in the context of somebody who has maybe just come on a very traumatic journey, escaping pretty horrendous circumstances, and then we're judging whether or not their face looks honest. There's really big questions about what data was used to give that indication of what was an honest face in that context. What would you expect, and also what kind of cultural presumptions are at play there. So yes, people say algorithms can detect a lie, but I think there were some big questions about it.
Yeah, it's fine, it's fine. Maybe I get off now.
No.
Oh.
It's because the people at the back have.
Oh, I see. Yeah, so thank you very much. I mean, to kind of educate us about the dangers of the algorithms and stuff like this. But kind of going back to her point as well, by kind of talking about the disadvantages and the dangers of the algorithms, do you think it will kind of instill a fear of algorithms in the public? And in a way, of course, we use machine learning algorithms because there are advantages, and kind of for the general public have a fear of using these algorithms, even though in a bigger picture it might have a bigger advantage. So I was thinking, how could you have a balance if you, as a data scientist, or
No, absolutely, you're right. There are huge advantages from algorithmic decision making, from use of algorithms in say, public life, and there's a lot of evidence that using algorithms can improve efficiency of public spending, can improve efficiency of allocation of resources, can help us make decisions about where best to focus services, and there are really, really positive examples where that can work very well. I don't think it's about making people scared of algorithms, creating a fear of algorithms, but certainly, I guess, combating a complacency of algorithms. I think often when we talk about, or we hear about algorithms, we tend to hear about it in terms of, say, advertising. It's an algorithm that decides what advert shows up when you open your emails, or what advert follows you around on the internet. Algorithms that decide which Facebook post comes up at the top of your feed. And we hear about algorithms in all these kinds of contexts where the implications are kind of, like it may be a bit annoying, but it's not terrible. So it's kind of things you can live with. It's kind of things where you go like, oh well, it doesn't matter, maybe don't like it, but it doesn't matter too much. So I think being aware of these other examples is really important, because that complacency can lead you into all kinds of situations. And if we're not questioning, and if we're not raising concerns about the ways that algorithms are being used now, then in the not too distant future, how they could be being used is scary, and there should be some fear about that. I think the example of Google Project Maven with the Pentagon, Google potentially creating an algorithm that could automate where bombs are dropped, that seems like an extreme example. But if we are complacent about how things have been done now, that's not unrealistic. In the not too distant future, that could happen. And if that makes you feel uncomfortable, then you need to kind of take a few steps back and think, well, what is it that's uncomfortable, and what's the difference between what's happening now? How many steps away from that situation are we in? And that's where we can't be complacent, because we need to ensure that we don't end up at that position that I think most people would kind of go like, that's not okay. But we need to say it's not okay before we get to that point.
We have time for one last question if anyone's got an issue that he wants to.
Just based on what you just said, why would it be more dangerous to have an algorithm decide where to bomb than a human decide where to bomb? It both seem equally bad to me. So
yeah, I mean, generally I'm against bombing. Drones bombing. I take your point. But I think that the danger there is that it's the automation, it's the lack of kind of human oversight. So there have been examples in the past of where there's been a human decision about whether or not to take an action, like drop a bomb or take an action like that. And there's been instances where following protocol by the letter would say, yes, in this instance you drop a bomb. But a human has a kind of gut instinct, a morality that says, actually, no, there's something that's not quite right here, and they hesitate. And there's been instances where actually that hesitating was the right thing to do, because actually something wasn't quite right, even though everything in the protocol said that it was. And there are instances like that where if you leave it to an algorithm, well, it's going to do it by the rules, by the conditions. And there was some machine learning program, well, we don't really know what it's doing it by. It's basing it on some sense of what is the right thing to do in that context, but we don't really know. And so there is that need for that human judgment or kind of morality in there. There's also, what's really important is that this is that values change, and what matters to us as a society or as individuals change going forward. And algorithms or machine learning programs are based on data, but they're also based on judgments of the past. And they take judgments, human judgment, which informs how the algorithm is designed and how it is used, at a certain point in time. Now, as time moves on, our values change, our ideas change, our concepts of what is the right thing to do change. And an algorithm maybe doesn't, or doesn't in a way which aligns with those values and those kind of cultural ideas about what is the right thing to do. So I think that that's a real danger, that if we leave this to an automated process and we assume that the automated process is correct because it was judged correct at a certain point in time, that doesn't mean that it's still correct at a later date or in a later context.
I think there's actually just one last.
So you're saying we shouldn't have self-driving cars because they're subject to the same kind of argument that a self-driving car doesn't have that judgment that a human doesn't have.
Well, and actually, in the development of autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars, morality is a huge thing there, and it's one of the problems that when they're developing the algorithms for automated vehicles or self-driving cars, because actually there are judgments that we have to make all the time. So if you're probably going to, you know that you're going to crash, and you choose, do you crash into a cyclist or another vehicle? Do you crash into a vehicle that you can see there's a baby inside, or not? You know, all these kinds of judgments, these kinds of split-second decisions that we have to make in those contexts, that actually they have to program a car to make that decision. And in doing that, you have to actually answer those questions that we find very hard to answer ourselves. So you have to program a moral judgment of what's the right thing to do in a certain context. And actually, it's really difficult in reality when you're driving and there's a split-second decision where you have to decide how you're going to react in a second. Are you going to, for an autonomous vehicle, is it going to protect the car, or is it going to protect the pedestrian? Is it going to prioritize the driver's safety, or the stranger, the pedestrian, whoever it is, or the cyclist? And those kind of moral judgments that have to be programmed. And that's a really, really hard step in terms of developing autonomous vehicles. Like, how do you actually just make those decisions and decide that that's the right decision to be kind of set in stone in an algorithm that's going to function in a car?
Actually, I think we have reached the end of the last Codia 2019. Ooh, so huge round of applause.